Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of qualitative research. So, qualitative research is very different than quantitative research. It is a very different approach to research. The goal of qualitative research is to really capture the experience or the narrative of your participants, whereas in quantitative research, we were really trying to capture numbers and figures and create comparisons and differences. But here we're going to be talking about something that's completely different. So here's a checklist of questions you can use when designing qualitative research. I think this is a really good list that helps you kind of check off and make sure that you've done everything that you need. So as you're developing your final projects, for instance, this would be a great checklist to use to make sure you've covered all your bases. Here's a little bit more about it. I really want to stress this last part, multiple strategies for validating findings, and we'll be talking about that later in this presentation. So what are the characteristics of qualitative research? Well, first, we always have to identify the needs of our potential audience. Who's going to care about our study, right? We're going to have to talk about, maybe is it in a natural setting, that the researcher is part of the study, that means you bring all your biases into the study, and that you need to seek out multiple sources of data, and you're going to use inductive and deductive data analysis. We're really going to focus mostly on what the phenomena that we're studying, what it means to the participants. And one of the things that's really unique about qualitative research is that it's an emergent design. So that what it means is that you're going to establish an initial design, but as you go into, say, interviews or document analysis, you may find that you need to change your design in order to capture everything that you want. Unlike quantitative research, qualitative research is very tolerant of changes to design afterwards. Now, if you have IRB approval, you have to file an amendment and let them know what's going on. But overall, there's an expectation with qualitative research that, say, the interview questions might change as you go through the process, or the questions you're using to guide a document analysis might change as you go through the process. And really, the goal is this holistic account, that we're not going to put lenses on and try to find evidence to support what we believe. We're going to try to be very open to our experience with the participants and what their experience is, and really reserve any analysis for when you have multiple sources of data, and then you can look for themes and patterns in that data. So there are very specific approaches to qualitative research, just like in quantitative research. There's procedures for how to collect, analyze, and write up your results. The most common qualitative research methods or designs are narrative, phenomenological, ethnography, case study, and grounded theory. Now, just a note, ethnography can be quantitative or qualitative or even mixed methods. In this particular case, ethnography would be collecting information about people within their natural settings. So it wouldn't be numeric based as in quantitative, but more qualitative or narrative based. The researcher has a very important role in qualitative, and that is because they're engaging directly with the participants. They're interviewing the participants, or they're looking at the documents, or they're observing the people that they're studying. Everything is happening really in a very intimate and close way. So ethical issues can arise, and one of the things that researchers want to disclose in their qualitative research is, what is their experience with the phenomena that they're studying? What is their experience with the participants, the setting, or the research problem? And how do these experiences shape their interpretations, or maybe bias their interpretations? And something that you might need to do when you're coding and identifying themes is have some memos to indicate what that researcher bias might be. And then also really making sure that you've got very clear IRB permissions, and the IRB is fully informed about what your connections are to the participants, the setting, and the research problem. You need to disclose how you're getting access to your setting. You need to disclose who the gatekeepers are that are making sure the participants are taken care of. For example, when you're writing gatekeepers, you might want to say why you chose the site, what activities will occur, how you're going to minimize how disruptive the study is, how the results will get reported, and then how are you going to get the results to the gatekeeper. In qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, we are going to purposefully select the individuals and sites that help us best understand the problem. We're going to discuss how we're going to recruit or sample. That's our sampling, right? And we're going to comment on the number of sites and participants. How do we know that that's enough? With qualitative research, we don't have necessarily calculators to help us like we do with quantitative, but we do have a concept called saturation. So typically in a qualitative research, you're going to say something like, I'm going to attempt to recruit 8 to 10 participants. But in qualitative research, if at participant 6, you have achieved saturation and you're not getting any new information, you can stop. You don't have to go all the way up to 8 and just collect the same information. Now, you can go ahead and collect the 8 if you want, but once you've achieved saturation and no new information is emerging, you can stop your sampling. You can stop building that sample. And, you know, one of the best ways to find out kind of the range for the research design that you're using is looking at articles, looking at dissertations that have been written, and just looking at the textbook to see, you know, is there a recommended range for this particular design? Now, there's lots of ways to collect data in qualitative. Could be observations, interviews, document reviews. You could be looking at audio-visual materials, anything that's going to give you words or the experience of individuals. Now, in your book, there is a qualitative data collection types, options, advantages, and limitations. Definitely would encourage you to review that because I think it does a great job of talking about what the pros and cons are of each type of data collection. And I want you to think about this as you're proposing, or if you're proposing a qualitative study, make sure you think through each one of these things and consider how the collection method you use can impact your results. Here's for interviews, this was for observations, interviews, documents, and then audiovisual. So no matter what you choose to do for your data collection, you need to be very specific about what you're going to be using to collect your information, and you want to potentially have more than one source of information in order to help validate your results. Here's some more information on the procedures that you can use in order to collect data. Each one of these, again, has pros and cons to it. For example, one-on-one interviews are really great because you get to work individually with that individual, but there's a greater chance for some maybe potentially bias. And there's also, it's going to take you a lot longer to do one-on-one interviews. Whereas focus groups, you can have, you know, 8 to 10 people in a focus group, but then you risk having groupthink, where everybody starts to think the same way, or people who might think differently are intimidated and not willing to speak up. And so there's pros and cons to each type of qualitative data collection. So here's the protocol for the recording. So if you're doing observational, you'll record notes. You write reflexive or reflective notes, demographic information, setting. Interview, you're going to have your information about your interview, your questions, how did you open, how did you close. Usually it's 5 to 10 questions, depending on the amount of time that you've set aside for your interview. One of the things that's really important is that an interview guide, an observational tool, these are all tools that you probably are having to create for yourself. So you're going to also have to validate that instrument to make sure that it's valid. And this actually happens before Institutional Review Board review. And so you would create your instrument and then you would test it in some way. You could use a Delphi study, you could do a field test, you could do a pilot study. And those are 3 distinct ways that you can do validation, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. So for your data analysis, you're going to want to kind of pull the data apart and then put it back together. When I did my master's thesis, I did qualitative research. I did a case study looking at three traditional age women who attended an all-women's college and who had a disability. And each one of them had acquired their disability at different points in their life. And they were all different ages, different races, different socioeconomics. So really the only things that they were the same of was having a disability, even though they had different disabilities. They all had a disability. They were all college students. They were all women. And they were all between the ages of 18 to 21. But everything else I tried to differentiate on. But when I got my data analysis, I had literally pages and pages and pages and pages of transcripts from these interviews. And I had to really read through those interviews, watch the recordings, read through the interviews again, watch the recordings, highlight the interviews as I was watching the recordings, and really start to identify themes. What were the things that were very similar across the three experiences that I was looking at, but what also might differ and why? And so I had to like really shred up the transcripts and pull them apart and pull out excerpts that I thought represented each theme, and then tried to really boil it down to, in my case, I got it down to 5 themes. Now, there is computer software you can use like Atlas TI and NVivo, but they're only going to be able to help you to a certain extent, because with qualitative research, it really is a lot about intuition and reading between the lines. So you really have to have that humanness about you to be able to really call out the themes and codes to the level that they need to be done. So the qualitative research software programs are good for helping you identify where there might be similar words used, and it can help you find patterns of words, but it's not really good at identifying themes per se. That really takes a human and the humanness that we carry with us to be able to do that. Here's how data analysis might work within a data analysis of qualitative research. You can see that there's kind of a circular process here, right? So you start off with the raw data, you organize the data, then you read through the data, you code, you identify themes and descriptions, you interrelate those, then you interpret the meaning, you validate it, but then you kind of have to go back through this process again and reorganize the data, read through the data again. So this is a circular process that takes multiple cycles in order to be able to do, because if I take my data back to, or my themes back to my participants, and one of my participants says, no, that's not what I mean at all, this is what I meant, then I'm gonna have to circle back and go through this process again. So here's the procedures: organize, prepare your data, read and look at the data, start coding the data, which is looking for common language, common themes, generate a description and themes, represent those description and themes. Love to have figures and quotes in qualitative research, want to show what people are saying and how. And then here's the 8 steps to coding process. This tells you how to actually find those themes in concrete words. So there's different categories of codes. There's expected codes, there's surprising codes, there are codes that are unusual, and there's predetermined codes. And so one of the things you might want to do is, break out your codes by these different categories. You can give them different names, but what surprised you? What was expected? What was really, not normal? And why might that be? And so your goal here is to really just explore all the different ways and codes and try to open yourself up to the experience of your participants. Now, there's a bit of interpretation in qualitative research. And quantitative research, we really have statistical analysis and inferences. We do inferential statistics, so we make inferences from it. In qualitative research, we're doing interpretations. We're summarizing the overall findings. We're comparing it to the literature. Does it agree? Does it disagree? Why? Why not? If we have a theoretical lens, we'll use a theoretical lens to understand the data and really try to explain what was meant by the participants' experiences. And as always, we'll suggest the limitations of our research and make proposals for future research and potentially even practice. Now, In qualitative validity, this is where we're determining if the findings are accurate from the standpoint of the researcher, participants, or readers. And there's lots of different ways to validate. Triangulation means that you have 3 different perspectives on it. It might be the researcher, a research assistant, and the participant. That might be one way to triangulate. Member checking is bringing my results back to my participants before I publish or write them up too much, and asking my participants if that's what they really meant. Did I capture their words? Did I get their themes of what they were trying to say? You also want to give a really rich and thick description. The more detail you can give in qualitative research, the better, especially in how you do things and why you do things. One of the things you do have to be careful, though, is you don't want to give so much information that your participants are identifiable. And so there has to be some balance in that, because with qualitative research, you're using such small samples. And if you give the setting and the too much detail about the individual, it would be easy to figure out who it was. Clarify any bias, own your bias, state your bias, talk about how you're going to protect your results from that bias, and provide it negative information. If something doesn't agree or concur with your expected findings, share that. That will show that you're showing both sides of the coin, so to speak. Have an external auditor, have somebody come back in and look at it afterwards. I do this often for my doc students and looking at their data and trying to see what my conclusions might be. And then peer debriefing. Just working with peers. I was very fortunate when I did my dissertation that I worked on a research team. So I had peers that would help me kind of think through problems and struggle through things and talk about the results. And then just experience, right? Experience creates some sense that you know what you're doing. Now, qualitative reliability, this is where we want to be consistent across different analysts or projects. We want to check transcripts for mistakes. We want to make sure that our coding is staying very consistent. There's communication and interreliability among the coders. With the research team that I was on for my doctoral work, I was very fortunate because we had like this internal auditor system. So part of our research was taking qualitative results and coding them into quantitative numbers. And one of the things that we would do, well, first of all, we had a really extensive training that we had to go through about the instrument so that we understood the instrument and how it should be scored. We did some practice scoring during that training so that we could start to understand how the scoring should be done. And then each one of 3 people scored the same instrument each time. So 3 people scored it. So we had 3 results, and we would take the average of those results as the actual score. And so that was one way we created reliability and validity. We also want to talk about a qualitative generalization. Unlike quantitative, this isn't something that's necessarily generalizable to the larger population because we're going to have such a small sample size, but we could potentially generalize it to people that are very, very similar to the people we use, but still with a little bit of a caution. When you write up your qualitative research, you will plan for the narrative. There's going to be a lot of descriptions, a lot of themes, a lot of quotes. You're going to want to really make sure that you're capturing the culture and the context of the individual. It's appropriate to use first person in qualitative reports, and also metaphors and analogies. So just using and capturing the participants' words to tell your story. And then finally, as a summary, the components of writing a qualitative research methods section is that, you want to talk about the qualitative characteristics, the data collection, the data analysis, what your expected outcomes are, and how you are validating your results. And we went through a long list of those. And that is the end of our qualitative presentation. I hope this was helpful, and I will talk to you soon.